I'll again note while we're waiting for the last people to come into the room, you can ask questions. There's several methods of doing that. There's a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. There's the chat section, and then you can raise your hand, as they say, which means that Rena Olson, who's lurking behind the scenes and is our communications person, can actually then let you speak directly. We will hold off on answering raised hands and questions until the end of the talk, but if you have a quick question you want to put it in chat, we might be able to glance at that and answer it as we go along. So I think we've reached 7 o'clock, so to start promptly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Philip Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. We are celebrating all year our 50th anniversary year. We have not spent a lot of time looking back over our fairly considerable record of achievements in protecting the coast. We have almost exclusively been looking forward. The theme of our anniversary year is the next 50 years of coastal conservation. And our speaker tonight very much plays into that. And I've just right now put in a plug for the next talk we're doing on October 26th, when coastal policy expert and climate policy expert Gene Flemma will be talking on the future of ocean policy, the kinds of things we can do in those next few years. Oregon Shores, if you're not familiar with us, is a comprehensive regional conservation group, by which I mean we potentially tackle the full range of threats to Oregon's coastal environment. We deal with land use planning, water quality, shoreline management, marine conservation, endangered species, the whole range of possibilities. We work from the crest of the coastal mountains to the edge of the continental shelf. Our Coast Watch program, through which volunteers adopt 1 mile segments of the Oregon coast, is a good entry point for getting involved with us. We always need additional watchers on the shoreline. If you'd like to learn more about the work we do and consider volunteering, I'd urge you to contact or to visit oregonshores.org, our website. While there, you can also find out about 2 ways to support us immediately beyond joining, which is the 50th anniversary auction we have running now with some new items to look at, and also our mile by mile competition. It's sort of a friendly competition, a beauty contest, if you will, in which people donate to honor 1 mile stretches of the Oregon shoreline, and at the end, both the mile that has the greatest number of donors and the mile with the greatest dollar total will earn a special treat for those donors. So, as I say, we've spent 50 years protecting the coastal environment. And in the many years I've been in this position, I've had an opportunity to introduce a great many speakers. Every once in a while, that task affords me a very special pleasure. And that's when I can take an eminent scientist, someone who's made important contributions to her field and has provided us with information we need about our environment, and call her out as a slug. But tonight's speaker, Dr. Kristy Kroeker, is indeed a slug, namely a banana slug. She is a professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz, my alma mater, which, if you didn't know, has the banana slug as its totemic animal. The students actually pushed that through. The administration had wanted something respectable like sea lions, but the students insisted on banana slugs. And when the administration stopped sulking about it, they realized the students had handed them a major marketing coup, because marine mammal images are a dime a dozen, but no one else has the banana slug. And since that time, they fully embraced it, and banana slug iconography is shot through the university's publications and bulletins and so on. Another thing you might not know about my alma mater is it's the home of the Long Marine Lab and has become one of the nation's, if not the world's, leading outposts for marine and coastal research. So in that matter, the university is not sluggish at all. And Kristy Kroeker is very much part of that. He's an associate professor in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department, associated with the Institute of Marine Science at UC Santa Cruz. She's also a core faculty member in the Coastal Science and Policy graduate program there. Her PhD is from Stanford University, but I've just learned in chatting with her, she is actually an Oregonian who grew up in Gresham, taught middle school in Portland before she went back to school to get her PhD. And her husband's from Astoria, so we're actually welcoming her back to Oregon. Her research focus is on such very fundamental matters as community ecology, species interactions, global change biology. And she and the people in her lab then apply these fundamental concepts to such things as coastal sustainability, social and ecological systems, and ocean policy and management. Of course, climate change looms behind all of these areas of study and is pushing changes in the ocean. So here to talk to us tonight about our changing ocean, I give you Dr. Kristy Kroeker.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, great. So Philip, can you let me know that my screen looks okay? You guys can see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. So as Philip mentioned, it is my pleasure to join you. As an Oregonian, I only wish that I could be there in person, but I hold that part of the coast very, very, very close in my heart. So I'm going to talk tonight about our changing oceans, and in particular, trying to scale up the effects of global change from organisms to ecosystems. So let's see here. So research in my lab at UC Santa Cruz is really centered at the focus of community ecology, environmental change, and policy and management. And by working at this intersection, our intention is really to inform sustainable management options of our oceans into the future. Now, as a community ecologist, which is really where my training lies, I'm in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department. This is my view of the world. I've always been very, very interested in what happens to at an organismal scale, how that actually scales up to the patterns that we see in nature. So what happens to this fish as it interacts with the other organisms in its environment? And I think that this is especially pertinent in light of ongoing environmental changes associated with climate change that fundamentally affect individual organisms, but can scale up to these really profound effects on our whole ecosystems. Now, when I'm talking about environmental change in the ocean, I'm really talking about three major changes. So the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is causing the process of global warming, which probably everyone is very familiar with. The oceans have absorbed over 90% of the heat that's associated with global warming, making the oceans warmer as well. Now, probably what's less familiar to people is that warmer water holds less oxygen, so the oceans are also going through a process of deoxygenation. At the same time, the oceans have absorbed over 25% of the carbon dioxide that we've emitted since the Industrial Revolution. Now, this causes a series of predictable changes in the chemistry of the ocean, which leads to a process called ocean acidification, whereby our oceans are becoming more acidic through time. Now, the challenge is really to understand how these three changes in the environment that are happening concurrently affect individual organisms, scale up to these patterns in nature. So for my talk today, I'm going to kind of try to break this down into three different sections. I very much wish we could be in person so I could field your questions as we're going. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the chat and answer questions if I can. The three sections that I'll go through really starts there on the left, where I'm going to talk about what's actually happening in terms of warming, deoxygenation, and ocean acidification, in particular on the US West Coast. So I'm going to try to give you some examples from the California current where Oregon is situated. And then I'm going to transition to thinking about one of these stressors, ocean acidification, how that affects marine organisms with a case study on pinto abalone, actually. And then finally, I'll spend some time talking about another set of experiments we've been doing, thinking about red sea urchins, so a really important commercial fishery that across the California current that is a little bit more complicated based on what's happening here in California and Oregon in the ocean. So I'll walk through those. Hopefully we'll have time. But starting with what's actually happening in the California current. Okay, as I mentioned, these are the three stressors that I'll talk about, starting with the warming ocean. The world is heating up overall. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that, and that includes the oceans. The oceans are not immune to that. We've already seen major changes, and by the end of the century, depending on human behavior, we're looking at anything from a mean change of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius to up to 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. And here I'm just showing you two scenarios. So on the left is the best case scenario. So this is human intervention and very strong reductions in carbon dioxide emissions over the next few years. On the right is what we call the business as usual scenario, so very little changes in our behaviors or emissions. We are actually on track for the highest that business as usual scenario at this point. So we're looking at pretty profound changes in temperature. But while that's happening, in the background, we're also faced with changes in extreme events. So here I'm showing you a picture of a warm blob. So this is a temperature anomaly. And you can see there it's situated off the west coast of the United States. Probably many of you were familiar with the blob that happened in 2014 and 15. This is not the most creative name, but essentially this area of hot water set up and then sat off the coast, west coast of North America for a year and a half, almost 2 years, and was thus named the blob. Now, what I'm showing you is not actually the 2014-15 heat wave. I'm showing you a heat wave that happened in 2019, because very similar thing happened in 2019, followed by a very similar thing happening in 2021. And as we move forward with climate change, we're expecting these heat wave or these extreme events to happen more frequently and to become more intense through time. Now, these marine heat waves, I think, give us a really unique view into what warming can do to our marine environment. And here I'm just capturing a couple of headlines, one from National Geographic, one from the New York Times. Capturing the massive changes that we see over this 2014 and 15 heat wave, the 2019 heat wave, and the 2021 heat wave, where we saw large scale mortality across a really wide range of marine species. In Northern California, we saw the disappearance of a lot of our kelp forests that have been linked to these warmer water conditions, as well as some species interactions, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But these are areas, this is area of concern. So it's not something that's happening way in the future. This is something that we're already experiencing now. Now, what causes marine heat waves in the California current off the coast of Oregon? They are linked to climate change. We can actually see when we don't include human emissions, marine heat waves do occur, but they don't occur as frequently. And it's almost impossible that some of the heat waves that we've seen so frequently recently would have occurred without anthropogenic climate change. In particular, this last heat wave in 2019 was associated with weakening of some of the winds, reduced cloud cover, which resulted in less evaporative cooling and less mixing of the deep ocean water with the surface water. Warmer water is less dense, and so it doesn't want to mix with the lower water. And so we got this shoaling in this really, really thin mixed layer of very, very warm conditions. Looking forward, we expect marine heat waves to increase both in the intensity and the frequency. Here I'm showing you a few different things. So on the left is the observation data shown in black, as well as the red showing that worst case scenario, and now in orange, or orange and brown, is kind of our middle of the road scenario. It's not our best case, but it's kind of middle of the road through time. And what I really just want you to see is that we're seeing the same pattern regardless of the scenario, where heat waves will increase quite rapidly, both in this intensity and frequency going forward. Okay, so that's a real short take on the changes in temperature. At the same time, we're seeing changes in the oxygen content of the ocean. I'll come back to that in a little bit because I want to focus first on acidification, which really links the warming and acidification to affect the oxygen content. Okay, acidification is driven by the absorption of carbon dioxide into the surface ocean. So this has been a really good thing for warming in that it's actually slowed down the greenhouse effect, because over a quarter of the carbon dioxide that we've emitted since the Industrial Revolution has actually been absorbed into the ocean. Here I'm showing you the change in pH, with warmer colors being more acidic or lower pH conditions. And since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen about a 0.1 unit pH decrease in the surface ocean. Now, if we look forward 100 years, now we're looking at 1995 to 2095, and the color bar is the same. Warmer colors are more acidic. You can see that we're expecting about 100% increase in the acidity of the ocean in the next 100 years. And another thing to note is that this is happening everywhere. There's not really any place that will be spared from acidification. However, we do have hotspots of acidification, and Oregon and California sit in one of those hotspots. So here I'm showing you some modeled figures from 2005 to the year 2050. And again, so this is only mid-century, whereas the figure I just showed you before was the end of the century at 2100. The color bar is much the same. And you can see that by mid-century, we're seeing similar colors, similar pH values, similar acidity than we're expected to see in many other areas of the ocean by the end of the century. And we're going to see those here in the year 2050. That is linked to the process of upwelling. So if you're not familiar with upwelling, this is a natural process that occurs regularly off the coast of Oregon and California. It's primarily caused by differences in the heating of the land in the ocean. So the land heats up faster than the ocean. This causes winds to start. Those winds tend to blow down the coast in North America on the West Coast. As those winds blow down the coast, the earth is turning, and the Coriolis effect pushes the surface waters, pushes the wind offshore, which pushes the waters offshore, the surface waters. And those surface waters are replaced by cooler water that's upwelling from deep below. Now, those cool waters from deep in the ocean tend to have more carbon dioxide naturally. As the process of acidification progresses, those waters are becoming more and more acidic through time. So this acceleration that we're seeing in California current, off the Oregon coast, and acidification is acidification writ large, the global process being accelerated by this local oceanographic process, which is drawing up water that is naturally more acidic and becoming more acidic through time. Now, this is already having effects on the on West Coast species. This is some headline from the Seattle Times. This is actually almost 10 years ago now that this headline happened. So in hatcheries in Oregon, across Washington as well, there were some major failures in the early life history stages of oysters, and they couldn't get their oysters to survive. And we were actually, through some really innovative science industry partnerships, we were able to show that, and I say we, the royal we, the science industry partnerships, were able to actually show that these mortality events of early or young oysters were actually associated with acidification, with these low pH waters coming into hatcheries associated with upwelling events. So this is a major concern for the oceans now, and will continue to become worse moving into the future. Okay, so as I said, now coming back to this process of deoxygenation. Now, what causes deoxygenation? What's happening there? Okay, the first thing is really simple. That warmer water holds less oxygen. So as the ocean warms up, you're going to have a lower oxygen content. And that is happening globally. Now, the other process is linked to biology and to the upwelling that I talked about associated with acidification. So oxygen concentrations tend to be highest in the surface ocean because phytoplankton are in that area where there's lots of sunlight. They're using the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis and they're producing oxygen. When those phytoplankton die or are eaten by something else that dies and they sink to the bottom of the ocean, they are decomposed by microbes, which release that carbon dioxide and use up the oxygen. So those upwelled waters that I talked about that tend to have more carbon dioxide in them, this is the process. And so not only do they have more carbon dioxide and are lower pH, but they have less oxygen in them. And this process is getting worse with acidification because that carbon dioxide that's moving into the surface ocean actually increases the productivity of the phytoplankton. And so this whole thing gets kind of sped up and you get even lower oxygen concentrations and more carbon dioxide in the deep ocean. As upwelling happens, so here I'm showing you a cross section where we've got brown, you've got the land, and then you've got the ocean off to the other side on the left. The process of upwelling is bringing those low dissolved oxygen, high dissolved inorganic carbon, that means high carbon dioxide, waters up into the surface ocean where they get more sunlight. The phytoplankton can bloom using some of the nutrients in that water, but they're actually, as those phytoplankton die down, they're exacerbating the process and reducing the oxygen in that upwelled water. Now this, I'm sure you're very familiar with because these headlines are associated with the Oregon coast, and you have some really spectacular scientists working on this issue up in Oregon at OSU. But this is a headline from the Washington Post just recently. Because these low dissolved oxygen conditions that happen, especially on the continental shelf, can affect really important fishery species such as Dungeness crabs. Okay, so that's the kind of 101 of environmental change on the Oregon coast and the west coast of the US more broadly. And the thing that I want you to get is that on the US West Coast, we're really in a hot spot of change. And not only are we seeing acidification and deoxygenation, but we're also facing more extreme events such as marine heat wave. And these will become more common moving into the future. So my research is really focused on what does that mean for the ecosystem? Now, a lot of the work that we are doing is trying to understand what it means for organisms and then what that means more broadly for an ecosystem. I tend to focus on seagrass ecosystems as well as kelp forest ecosystems. And the two examples I'll give today are really from kelp forest ecosystems. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about some research we've been doing with the pinto abalone. And this research, again, is thinking about these different stressors, but primarily focused on acidification, at least this initial stuff that I'll talk about. Okay, so in order to kind of walk you through what we're doing, I'm going to give you a little bit more information on acidification. And if you haven't taken a chemistry class in a while, don't be terrified. This is pretty straightforward. You don't need to memorize anything here. I'll tell you why I'm showing you this. If you are a chemist, forgive me for simplifying some of this. Okay, the process of acidification. What's happening here, carbon dioxide is absorbed into the surface ocean, basic diffusion. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is in the ocean. So it infiltrates the ocean, it reacts with water, and it forms this H2CO3, which is carbonic acid, shown in the middle of the screen. That acid dissociates into two different molecules, one of which is the hydrogen ion. That hydrogen ion is what gives, oh, sorry if my audio is breaking up a little bit. That hydrogen ion is what gives ocean acidification its name. So that's what makes the ocean more acidic. However, what's actually happening is a series of other chemical reactions that are just as important. The end result is threefold. And I'm showing you the changes in red. So you get more of what we call this bicarbonate, the HCO3 minus, and less carbonate, CO3 2 minus. Okay, stick with me for a minute. So those three red molecules that are changing in concentrations matter because they do different things for different organisms. So this one here that I'm showing you is a carbonate ion. And carbonate ions are used to build calcium carbonate shells. So things like abalone or sea urchins will have a harder time building their shells because there will be less carbonate ions in the ocean. And so we're likely to see reduced calcification for some of those organisms. We actually expect the HCO3 minus, this is called bicarbonate, to increase in concentration. And that's important because many algae in the ocean, including some kelps, can actually use that for photosynthesis. So they're using the carbon dioxide in that molecule for photosynthesis. And then last, changes in that hydrogen ion concentration can affect really a wide range of acid-base issues, as well as the behavior of many, many species. Okay, now the challenge is taking all of these different kinds of effects. So decreases in calcification or growth of calcified species, increases potentially in photosynthesis and growth of our marine algae, and changes in the behavior and the physiology of really a wide range of species. And putting it back into this context where you've got many different species that are interacting with each other in a kelp forest. Now we have some research that gives us some insight into how this might actually play out in really diverse ecosystems. Some of my really early work on ocean acidification and community level responses was actually at these natural carbon dioxide vents that I'm showing you here. So these are volcanic vents in very shallow water. They're in about 10 to 15 feet of water, so you can snorkel on them. They're not hot seeps. These are cool seeps. There's no changes in temperature. There's very little change in the other gases. And at these volcanic sites, the water chemistry is very similar to what we predict at the end of the century with continued acidification. So we can use these as a glass, as a looking glass or a crystal ball to look into the future of the oceans and see how do ecosystems change when you have all of these species responding in such unique and different ways. And I'm taking 10 years of my career and lots of figures and just putting it into these two photos here. So here I'm showing you what the ecosystem looks like in ambient conditions. We've got lots of diversity, you've got lots of different colors. There's a high abundance of calcified species. And on the right, I'm showing you what the community looks like near these carbon dioxide vents, where you have the diversity is greatly reduced. You've got a really high abundance or dominance of seaweeds that can use the carbon dioxide or the bicarbonate in the seawater, and very, very few calcified species. Now, we think that grazers might be a really important player in this change from these really diverse ecosystems to these really depauperate ecosystems that are dominated by algae. And that's because grazers or herbivores such as sea urchins play really important roles in our kelp forests and our other rocky reef systems. By grazing down the algae and creating these bare spaces where more rare or competitively inferior species can colonize and persist. In the low pH conditions, we think they may not be playing that role. And then you can see that the dominant forms of fleshy algae can overgrow the system and reduce the diversity overall. Now, this was really interesting to me in terms of kelp forests on the West Coast because we have some really important grazers such as sea urchins and abalone that we were interested in. How were they responding to changes in, how will they respond to changes in ocean chemistry moving forward? So the story about the pinto abalone is actually research that we've been doing in Southeast Alaska in Sitka Sound, where we have been measuring the temperature and the chemistry for a number of years. And here I'm just showing you one of our sensors we use to actually measure the chemistry in these kelp forests. And this is at about 20 feet depth, so relatively shallow kelp forest systems. And there I'm showing you both the temperature in red and the pH in blue over about a 1.5 year time. And you can see these really strong seasonal fluctuations in temperature first, where we have our highest temperatures in August and September, our lowest temperatures somewhere around March, but also this really strong seasonality in the carbonate chemistry of the ocean, where we see conditions in pH about 7.8 during the winter months. And these are values that we're not, again, expecting in most areas of the ocean until the end of the century. And these are being sustained for many months during the winters in Southeast Alaska. So we started working there to try to use these wintertime conditions as a window into thinking about how species might respond to acidification in the future. For this example, we focused on, again, the pinto abalone. This is a really culturally important and economically important species. And what we hypothesized is that acidification or reduced pH would increase the energetic demands of these abalone in order to maintain their calcified structures. They would need more energy. And I should note that this research was really supported by a graduate student and undergraduate student that I'm highlighting here, Cassie Powell and Emily Donham. Now, another thing you need to know about Southeast Alaska is that not only are the temperature and the carbonate chemistry or the pH very seasonal in nature, so is the algae. So here I'm showing 2 pictures of me doing surveys in both the winter and summer on the same area. And you can see just by the color of the water that in the winter months, there's very little light in the system to support algae or seaweeds growing. And so you get very little algae or seaweed versus the summer months where you have lots of nutrients, you have lots of sunlight. And so you get this really, really beautiful sub-canopy in the kelp forest ecosystem. Now, abalone need that seaweed for food. And so what we wanted to know is how are they responding to these low pH conditions in winter when there's very, very little food for them in the system. So we took abalone, we exposed them to 3 different pH conditions, which I'm showing you here, which are representative of what they might experience in the summer now, in the winter right now, and what a future winter might look like. And then we gave them either the algae that's available to them typically during the summer versus the one species that hangs around during the winter, which is the canopy forming Macrocystis pyrethra or the giant kelp, which you also see in Oregon. So to jump right to the chase, here I'm showing you our main result, which is growth on the y-axis for those 3 different conditions. And you can see that acidification affects, or the pH of the seawater affects their growth rates, where they grow more slowly in the current winter conditions and even more slowly in the future winter conditions. Now, this is when they have a really good diet full of seaweed. Now, if we only give them the seaweed or algae that's actually available during the winter months, we see a very strong reduction in growth rates. And in future winter pH conditions, we actually see loss of mass. So they're just not able to sustain growth, and they're actually losing mass in those conditions. So what does this mean? What it means to us is that their vulnerability to ocean acidification likely depend on the resources that are available to them. What food they have in the system is going to be really important in how they actually respond to ocean acidification. Now, this is really important here in California and Oregon because abalone and sea urchins and these other calcified species are not just facing the threat of ocean acidification, they're in this environment where they're also facing marine heat waves and deoxygenation. So here I'm showing you some research that was done by Meredith McPherson, who was a graduate student here at UC Santa Cruz, where she used Landsat images of kelp across the US West Coast to actually quantify how much kelp there was over time. So here I'm showing you the area that she surveyed on the left, and this is Northern California, moving up towards Oregon. You can see the darker green colors means areas of more kelp, lighter green means less kelp, and gray means no kelp at all. So what you can see is that kelp forests kind of move in and out through time, but generally they kind of come back, pop back or respond, come back after they've had some little low year and come back, and they come in and come out. After the 2014-2015 heat wave, which we call the blob, pretty much all of the kelp forests across the US West Coast disappeared. Now, we think this is primarily due to warming temperatures actually weakening the spikes of kelp or weakening their structural system, and then winter waves coming in and wiping out the kelp. And then the problem here is that they didn't recover. So now I'm showing you a figure that has the canopy area. This is again from Landsat images for the West Coast, the canopy area through time. And again, you can see that kind of it bumps up and down through time. It's a variable system that we're used to. I've highlighted two areas here. So in yellow, there's an El Nino. So this is also a time when we might have warmer temperatures than normal. And you see that reduction in kelp biomass associated with those warmer temperatures. On the right side of the screen, you see the marine heat wave, where also the kelp canopy disappeared, and then there was very little recovery afterwards. Now, the lack of recovery was actually due to sea urchins, which as they lost their food source, started to come out of the cracks and essentially prevent the kelp from recovering. So we've lost a lot of the resilience in this system, and these sea urchins are actually acting as a positive feedback to kelp. Let's see here. And this is just to give you a sense of what this looks like when these sea urchins really go out of control and then prevent the recovery of the kelp forest. Okay, so then thinking about what this means for the vulnerability of kelp forest species is that we know ocean acidification is likely to increase their energetic demands, or it's just going to make it harder for them to live in these conditions in the future. And at the same time, marine heat waves are likely to reduce the resources or the food that's available to these species. So we think this may act as a double whammy for kelp forest species. Okay, the last example I'm going to talk about is some research that we've been doing a little bit closer to home. And this is about the red sea urchin, which is supports a really important commercial fishery across the US West Coast. This is some research that's been done in collaboration with Reef Check California, where we have been putting out pH sensors and oxygen sensors and temperature sensors at these sites that I'm showing across the state of California. People are doing some similar work in Oregon as well. Here I'm showing you my collaborators that are doing some of this work. And here's what we actually see on the US West Coast. So I'm showing you time series of pH, temperature, and dissolved oxygen over a couple of months in the year of 2018. And what I want you to see is that these three variables, or these three aspects of the ocean chemistry and temperature, look very similar through time. And that's because of upwelling. So the process we talked about at the start of the hour. So lower pH water has less dissolved oxygen and is also colder because it's coming up from depth. So organisms or species in the California current or off the coast of Oregon are really going to have to deal with these three changes happening at the same time. I see a question from Nancy Thomas about sea urchins. I will come back to that in just a little bit. Okay, so in terms of this research on the red sea urchin, we asked some similar questions about does reduced pH, reduced dissolved oxygen and temperature affect their energy demands? We hypothesized that yes, it would make it harder for them to live in these conditions, but maybe they actually increase their feeding rate to deal with those increases in energy demands. And this is some work that was led by my graduate student, Emily Donham. And here are results. I'm just going to jump right into these results. So here I'm showing you a figure where if you move from the left to the right on the x-axis, you've got higher upwelling intensity or greater acidification and deoxygenation from lower temperatures on the right. And then you've got growth on the x-axis. And so after 3 months' time, we have a very clear reduction in growth associated with exposure to these low pH, low dissolved oxygen, low temperature waters. However, we don't see any change in their feeding rate. So now I'm showing you that same axis. So upwelling, acidification, deoxygenation, lower temperatures are changing on the x-axis. But now I've got feeding rates over 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months. And we see that across all of those experiments, we see really strong reductions in feeding rates. And that is also true when we give them an acute exposure. So if we just drop the pH and dissolved oxygen and temperature like we might see in an upwelling event, we see really strong reductions in feeding rates as well. So we see really no signs of compensation for these species in terms of how they're dealing with upwelling, even though they have evolved in upwelling environments. So what does this mean? Well, we think that on the West Coast in Oregon and in California, that upwelling really increases their vulnerability. So when we have spring upwelling and these strong winds, they are being exposed to low pH, low dissolved oxygen, low temperature conditions that are physiologically stressful for them, and they're not really compensating for that. Okay, now going back to the broader questions that I wanted to address. What I hope you get from my talk tonight are a few things. So on the US West Coast, we're sitting in this hotspot of change across multiple different variables, both temperature, pH, and dissolved oxygen. That winter conditions in some parts of the West Coast and upwelling in California and Oregon really are how organisms are going to be exposed to these conditions. And we're already seeing that they are quite vulnerable. It reduces their growth rates, and there's very little compensation happening. And for some of our kelp species, we think the combination of these two different stresses, the marine heat waves, as well as the acidification, will result in really kind of a 1-2 punch that are likely to be quite stressful for them. Okay, now, as someone who studies the effects of ocean acidification, deoxygenation, climate change is really central to all of my research. I don't want to leave you on a really down note. I think there's a lot that we can do and that we're working on to really understand, well, is there any capacity for these organisms or for the social-ecological system to adapt and change in ways that might prevent some negative outcomes? Or are there ways that we can promote the resilience of individual species, or again, the kelp forest ecosystem moving forward? So one thing that I will point out is that upwelling is really a mosaic. Here I am showing chlorophyll, or this is actually temperature conditions across the US West Coast. This is just one little snapshot where you see colder conditions. You're likely to see, those are your upwelling hotspots. And see Northern California and Oregon have have very strong upwell conditions. But it's not the same everywhere. So I used to think of acidification kind of like a blanket that was affecting a whole globe. When I think about it on the US West Coast, I think about it more like a quilt. And so there's this mosaic of conditions. And this mosaic might be really important. And so some of the questions that we're starting to ask now is whether this can actually facilitate evolutionary rescue. So organisms that are already in these really upwelling hotspots, are they better adapted than organisms that are coming from more stable or environments with less upwelling? Or can the cool spots, so the areas of very low upwelling, provide larvae or resilience for other populations? So those are some of the questions that we're asking now and trying to think about how can we actually protect some of these species moving forward. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there and hope that I have some time for questions. So all of my work is supported by a huge number of students, and I've just listed some of the folks here that have been really supportive of the work, as well as a lot of funders. So the David and Lucille Packard Foundation have been hugely supportive of my work, as well as the Sloan Foundation, the NSF, and UC Santa Cruz. Okay, so I will stop there, and then I'm happy to take any questions that people might have. And Rena, I can, or Nancy, I can go back to you. I saw that there was one question on the chat about asking me to restate whether sea urchins eat the kelp or block it from growing, or both. So sea urchins eat kelp. They are really, really voracious grazers. And by eating the kelp, they can actually block it from growing. So an urchin barren is not a good thing. That carpet of urchins that I showed you is not a good thing for urchins, but it is what they will do. It's kind of a negative spiral. It's what they will do if something were to limit their food resources. They can all come out and start eating, such that they're not patient enough to let the kelp then resettle and grow back. And so rather than letting it grow back, they will just eat the kelp as it settles and starts to grow, so that you really stop a kelp forest from being there. Now, many of these urchins can be very long lived. Red sea urchins can be over 80 years old. They can go very, very, very long time without actually eating very much. And so you can have this state of an urchin barren for very long periods of time. And in fact, they tend to persist until some disease event comes through and wipes out urchins enough, or for long enough, that the kelp can then reestablish and grow again.
If I may, I'll jump in with a question. As you're probably aware, there are efforts here and there to try to rescue kelp by removing purple urchins, at least from certain areas. What's your prognosis for that? Let's assume that they actually are successful at removing them, given what you've said about the impact of warming and low oxygen on the kelp. How well will they come back if hypothetically we remove the purple urchin barren?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that we're likely to continue to face marine heat waves, which is likely to affect kelp in a similar way. And so removing urchins might be a short-term fix in limited areas. It would be very hard to do that at the scale at which we've lost kelp forests, which are across much of the Northern California and parts of Oregon. And so in limited places, removing urchins could potentially allow kelp to reestablish if there is enough kind of kelp spores available to reestablish. But big picture, we're likely to continue to see marine heat waves, which will kind of cause the whole thing probably to happen again.
Wait, can you see the question there?
Yes. Yeah, so I see Nancy asking, would reintroducing sea otters or sea stars have much of an impact? That's a good question. So I'll start with sea otters. Sea otters do eat urchins, and so they can maintain kelp forest dominated systems. However, they don't really like urchins from barrens. because those urchins have very little meat in them. So just like we wouldn't like them because there's no uni in them, there's just nothing really to eat. Sea otters don't really like urchins from barrens either, unless there's nothing else for them to eat. And urchins are really prickly, so if they can find better food, they will eat that food. However, in a healthy kelp forest system where you already have a lot of kelp, urchins can, or sea otters can kind of prevent this type of thing from happening by keeping urchin populations at bay when those urchins are fat and fed. Now, sea stars is a really good question. In particular, people are really interested in Pycnopodia helianthioides, which is the sunflower star, and the role of that sunflower star in actually keeping urchin populations at bay. We don't actually know kind of how important sea star or sunflower stars are in kelp forest ecosystems. There've been one study up off of BC that showed that, like, oh yeah, they're eating some of the small urchins, and so they can help maintain the urchin populations or limit the urchin populations, but we don't have a lot of evidence of that, and we don't know. It's very unlikely that some of those sunflower stars are going to eat the really big urchins, but there's a lot of really active research on that. I'm involved in some of it. There's some really wonderful people in Oregon that are working on those types of questions. So Sarah Grape is one that comes to mind at Oregon State University that is trying to understand if sunflower stars would be helpful in this situation. The problem is we don't actually know how to restore sunflower stars. So they're not as easy to reintroduce because they were really decimated in most places.
Well, allow me to jump in with another question. Very briefly in passing, you alluded to seagrasses as one of the things you study. I'm just wondering what thoughts you have about seagrasses' role in buffering, acidification.
Yeah, I actually work on that topic in particular. It's complicated. So the question that people are really interested is can some of these plants or algae that photosynthesize actually draw down the carbon dioxide enough that they create this kind of bubble of favorable conditions that reduces the impacts of acidification at a really local scale. And we did a study recently where we had sensors out in all of these seagrass beds up and down the state of California. We found that, yeah, on average, seagrass beds are improving the seawater chemistry. They're drawing down carbon dioxide more so during the day than at night, right? They can only photosynthesize during the day. But we do see kind of sustained buffering from seagrasses. It's really dependent on the flow and kind of how big the bed is and how long that water stays in contact with the seagrass bed. So they can buffer the water a little bit. You can't buffer it a whole lot and for a really long time. So how important that actually might be for like protecting other species, I think is really unknown at this point.
Okay, do I see any other questions? If not, thank you very much. That was very clear and very alarming. But anyway, appreciate the very coherent understanding of what's happening off our coast. So we really appreciate your being here with us and hope that we will see you here in Oregon, your home base sometime soon.